Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Roberto Dell'Oro, and I'm the director of the Bioethics Institute here at LMU, also a professor in the Department of Theological Studies. I'm here with Sister Maria, whom I thank for the opportunity to have a conversation with you. She asked me to say a few things about my writing on a very important problem we are all addressing, we are all living today, and that is the pandemic and the reality of the pandemic. And to say something in light of my own professional identity, but of course, because a professional identity is always also a function of something like a personal definition, I will say something about myself as I'm talking about my, let's call it, expertise. Um, I'm originally from Italy. I have a background both in philosophy and in theology with doctorates in these areas, but I also dedicated a long time to specialize in the field of bioethics. Briefly explained, the field of bioethics is a field of study that deals with advances in medicine, in the life sciences, and looks especially at the ethical challenges in these very difficult areas. Certainly, one of the areas that have become prominent of late is also the area of public health and ultimately the concerns raised by the pandemic. What is a pandemic? Well, a pandemic is, of course, an infection disease problem which has a worldwide reach. It cannot be simply confined to a specific area, but in fact has the ability to invest every population in the world, and therefore it presents not simply medical problems, but problems of a, I would say, of a wider character, and that is problems of an ethical nature. For example, just to say something about this, we are all going around now with a mask because we try not only to protect ourselves, but also to protect others. This is, of course, an expression of our own responsibility toward others, and therefore it is an expression of the ethical attitude that we want to have toward others. I've been forced to think about the ethical issues raised by the pandemic for different reasons. I'm, as a Catholic thinker, also a member of an important academic body within the Catholic Church, and that is the Pontifical Academy for Life, that deals with questions of bioethics and the ethics of life. And therefore, I was recruited by the Academy to write, together with a few other scholars, a document that would express the position of the Church, or in any case, one of the expressions of the Church's position on this question. I ended up writing the document that in fact became the third important church document on the topic. There is a first document that actually preceded the pandemic. This is a letter Pope Francis addressed the Pontifical Academy with, called Humana, Communitas, the human family. And then there was a second document that was published very much at the beginning of the pandemic, when questions of rationing, questions of triage, questions of ethical decision making within intensive care units were most prominent. For example, one idea that some ethics committees suggested was that we should ration resources depending on the age of people, which really meant that a person coming into the ICU would simply be discriminated because she or he might have reached a certain age. The Academy was very clear in saying that, of course, the criterion for rationing should be neutral, meaning a criteria that has to do with the clinical capacity for recuperation or for the clinical capacity for restoration of health rather than age. When it came to our document to which I contributed, the question was different, and that is we were already for a number of months into the pandemic, and I suggested that perhaps rather than making an ethical statement, we actually write a statement that has more of a meditative character. In other words, what I proposed was that for the church, rather than sit up on a pedestal, let's say, and preach to everyone and say what everyone should do, the church should also recognize the efforts that have been made by the international community and by various ethics bodies within the international community, for example, the World Health Organization, the effort at thinking about an ethical response to the problems of the pandemic, but that the church should offer a meditation that dealt with something more profound, and that is, what kind of human lessons have we learned from the pandemic, and how do we connect these lessons to our own faith? We then wrote this document, which I propose to title Untimely Meditation in a Time of Pandemic. The term untimely meditation actually comes from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher from the 19th century, who wrote a very important book with the same title, Unzeitmäßige Betrachtungen in German. And the title means untimely meditation in the sense of uncomfortable meditation. And I thought that the church should come up with a meditation about the pandemic that would be uncomfortable. And that in revealing what actually the pandemic reveals, in revealing what actually the pandemic says of a certain way of dealing with nature, dealing with creation on our side, that actually triggered the problems of the pandemic. We assume that the pandemic is a problem with a natural etiology, meaning a natural cause, so potentially a transmission from an animal. But of course, a transmission from an animal entails a certain type of relation with the animal world, with the world of nature on our part. And so the pandemic essentially says that our own relation with creation, our own relation with nature, has been defined by an attitude of exploitation, an attitude of manipulation, an attitude of lack of respect, which then turns into a kind of response on the part of nature itself, which we end up paying. Thus, the lessons we have learned from the pandemic might be three. The first one has to do with the fact that this particular event, pandemic, touches us all, and so we come to realize that we do not live in an island. The word pandemic has to do precisely with the idea that everyone, pandemos, those are two Greek words, is affected. So the first lesson that we can learn from the pandemic is that none of us lives in an island, but that we are all part of the same community. So we cannot save ourselves, we cannot thrive individually, we cannot flourish individually unless we flourish together as a community, as a society. This also means that we cannot come out of this problem alone, but that we have to come out from this problem only if we create common solution. The second lesson has to do with what I called the lesson of finitude. And that means that in the experience of the pandemic, we have come to realize that we are all contingent. That is, that we are, but that we could also not be. And that perhaps the reality of so many people dying, so many people being affected by this illness has shown in a way how fragile our own human condition is. In the fragility, in the finitude, then, we come to see perhaps better the value of human life, a value that we somehow take for granted when we are healthy and everything goes well. But that in fact we come to appreciate for what it is, that is a given, a gift, when we realize that we no longer have it. The final lesson is what I called the lesson of absolute autonomy, or rather the failure of absolute autonomy. This has to do with a certain way of thinking about our own freedom and our own freedom of choice. If we think that our own freedom is unlimited, if we think that our own connection with reality is predicated upon hubristic premises, the idea that we can do whatever we want, then we come to realize in this occasion that no, our own freedom is actually limited, that we don't have an absolute freedom, that we have what I call a wounded freedom, and that our freedom is somehow defined by the realization that we cannot do whatever we want. We have to reckon with the limits of our own freedom. From these lessons, and I conclude, there emerges therefore a need for conversion. And so in this document, I plead for a call for a change of mind. A change of mind that takes us away from, again, the fictitious philosophies of individualism, absolute freedom, and lack of finitude, and converts us rather to the realization that we are all in the same boat, and that we can come out of this only if we exercise an ethical behavior that is ultimately defined by the principle of solidarity. Thus, the number of ethical principles that might be necessary to address the crisis, all of them are somehow collected around the notion of solidarity. Justice as solidarity, that is a way of thinking about the human being that is not defined by individualism, absolute freedom, the notion of our unlimited power, but rather a solidarity that is a wanting to be caring for one another and looking after one another on the premise that we are indeed together, finite and all.